Now you might be familiar with the famous marshmallow experiment from Stanford University. The idea of the experiment was that a child was taken into a room with a table and a marshmallow was put on the table in front of the child. The child was then told that the researcher was going to leave the room and that if they didn't eat the marshmallow, they would get a second marshmallow when the researcher returned. If they did eat the marshmallow, then they wouldn't. Now what would you expect to happen here? Well, some of the children gladly gobbled up the marshmallows on the table in front of them, while others tried to resist, some doing star jumps and all sorts of things to keep themselves occupied, but not eating the marshmallow. Now what's interesting about this study is that as they followed the children as they grew up, those who delayed the gratification, so didn't eat the marshmallow and waited for the researcher to come back, were found to have a correlation to a whole heap of other attributes that might be considered a positive thing. So for example, the children that delayed gratification generally obtained higher academic results, showed lower levels of drug abuse, had lower levels of obesity, and many other things that we would consider positive attributes. Now why am I bringing this up in a pension video? Well, it's simply because pensions are basically just a money version of that same experiment. We put money aside now in return for our future selves, so delaying that gratification to get a better retirement later on in life. Now the reason for the video is that United Learning, which is a trust that oversees around 90 academies, has recently started their own marshmallow experiment, but they're doing it with pensions rather than marshmallows, and I thought it would be interesting to take a look at what they're doing. So to understand the concept behind the experiment, you need to understand that there are two types of main private pensions. There are what's known as defined benefit and defined contribution. Now this isn't the video to go a deep dive into both of them, but the broad brushes are that a defined benefit means that every year you work, you accumulate a fixed benefit when you retire. So a common way that this works is that you might obtain a fraction of your salary for that year. So let's say you earned £30,000 in a year. If you worked a full year, you might obtain 1/60th or 1/70th or 1/80th of that. And that would be a consistent payment that you would then receive when you retire. And so you can see you're banking just an income for when you retire for every year that you work. On the other hand, a defined contribution pension means that you put money into a pot and there's a pot of money that sits there, and your income in retirement is dependent on how big that pot is by the time you retire. Now there's some really interesting stats around this that I also want to share to help set the scene. So the IFS have come out with a few points, and the really pertinent ones for this discussion is one, that the median income in retirement for someone on a defined benefit scheme is significantly higher than the median income in retirement for someone with a defined contribution scheme. So in other words, someone who worked their whole career with a defined benefit pension scheme attached will have a higher income in retirement than the average person who has a defined contribution pension scheme for their entire working career. But there are some caveats to this. So the scale is much wider for those with defined contribution schemes. So when you look at the very top end of the scale, those who have the most income and wealth in retirement are often those who had defined contribution pensions. And so these are people who have diligently put money away, delayed that gratification to build up a bigger pension pot for retirement. But at the other end of the scale, there are also a lot of people with defined contribution pensions where the pots are very, very small. And that's because they either haven't put very much money away or they just haven't really saved for retirement at all. Now, defined benefit schemes are really, here in the UK, only available now in the public sector. There are many private sector schemes still running, but most of them are now closed for people to come into. And that's largely due to changes in regulations around pensions over the last 30 years, which have changed what they can invest in. And so if you're a private sector worker in the UK, you almost certainly have a defined contribution pension. And if you're a public sector worker in the UK, you almost certainly have a defined benefit pension. Now, defined benefit pensions are often cited by those in the private sector as the gold-plated pensions. And so a lot of people consider it a really generous extra benefit for working in the public sector. But as I'm about to show you, that's not always the case. It can really vary, and it depends if you're willing to have the marshmallow now or later. So just cycling back to United Learning, what are they doing in their marshmallow experiment, and what can we learn from it? So United Learning run academies, as I said earlier, and for the teacher's pension scheme, that means that United Learning have to put 28% of someone's salary towards the teacher's pension scheme. Now that's obviously a fairly high cost, and that means that they can't pay the teachers as much because it costs them more for that teacher, because there's this big chunk of money that the teacher doesn't necessarily see at that point that goes towards the teacher's pension scheme. So what they've done is they've set up 3 options that you can have as a teacher. So one, you can just have the status quo. You stay enrolled in the teacher's pension scheme and it's as is. But then things start to get a little bit more interesting. So option 2 is that you could take a 5% salary bump, and in return you have to opt out of the teacher's pension scheme and you'll instead be enrolled in a defined contribution scheme. And then United Learning will contribute 20% towards your defined contribution scheme. So the idea is that this starts to become attractive for teachers because you can start getting pay bumps, but you're also still saving for retirement. And 20% is a really, really generous contribution. That's the kind of thing that's pretty much unheard of in the private sector. But as we've seen, that 20% going into the pension plus the 5% pay bump is still less money than the 28% that United Learning would have to put in if the teacher stayed in the defined benefit scheme. But there's also a third option that they're offering, and that's a 10% pay bump and a 10% contribution to a defined contribution scheme. And so again, we can see the numbers there quite clearly, that that's the most beneficial for United Learning because it's only a 20% cost to them, a 10% pay bump and a 10% contribution to pensions. So it almost slashes their pension saving requirement by a third. Now you can see that if you're the kind of person who likes the marshmallow now, why that might be attractive. Because basically you don't have to change anything about your job, but you can take a 5 or 10% pay bump without changing anything. Now of course you're giving something up, but you're not giving something up immediately, you're giving something up in the future. And so I'm really interested to see how this plays out. But I just wanted to run a couple of numbers and see what it would be if you were a savvy person and you were a teacher and offered this. What are your options? Now working out the output from a defined benefit pension is much, much harder than a defined contribution scheme because there's no pot that's just there that you can see and apply some kind of economic growth to because maybe it's invested in the stock market. So instead we're reliant on inflation data and various other metrics such as the amount of money that the employee earned through their career. And so I've made some broad brush assumptions here to come up with some rough numbers, and I've plugged them into some calculators online just to kind of back up my thinking. As the assumptions that I've generally made is that the teacher is on £35,000 per year and they have a 40-year career. And so that's quite static numbers to nice and work with. And that would mean that actually as a teacher when you retired, let's say you took it at the age of 60, that means you'd get around £17,500 per annum paid out from your pension, and you'd also get around a £50,000 lump sum when you retired. And that's pretty good. It's not bad going, especially when you add in state pension there. That means you'd get your £50,000 lump sum, and then you'd be having an income of around £29,000 per annum. So that's well on the way to almost replacing your entire full-time income from when you were working. But by this point, hopefully you'll have your mortgage paid off and your costs will be lower. So that should be fairly generous in terms of your retirement income. But what about if we took option 2? Now option 2 is the 5% pay bump, but 20% of your money going into a defined contribution pension. Now let's say you were a teacher and actually you didn't really care for the pay bump now, and you were happy to put that 5% into your pension. So this means that you'll be getting 25% going into your defined contribution pension. The benefit of this is obviously you can manage it as the teacher. You can invest it however you want because it's your money. It's not into a pot where you just reap some rewards for at the end. Now, there are loads of creative things that you can do with a private pension. You could invest in commercial property, for example. Not many people tend to do that with their pensions, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. So for the purposes of this, though, I've just assumed that it's going to be invested in the global stock market. Now, before its demise and ultimate purchase by UBS, Credit Suisse used to publish their annual yearbook of returns, and this would look at the long-term returns, inflation adjusted, for different asset classes around the world. And they pegged global equities at around 5% growth per annum. So with the average £35,000 salary, taking our 5% pay bump and the 20% contributions, that means that your contributions into your defined contribution pension would be around £654 per month. Now if we plug in 5% return, and this is after inflation, so this is a real return, so that means the numbers that we're talking about are numbers in today's money, you would see that you would have a pension pot of pretty much bang on £1 million by the time you came to retire at age 60. Now that's £1 million in today's money, so in nominal terms it would potentially be significantly more. Now obviously putting aside all the caveats here, that the stock market doesn't grow in nice gentle 5% per year, it will have 10%, 15% up years, and then there might be 20% down years, and so on and so forth. And so there is additional risk in terms of this, but it gives us a good benchmark number to look at. So what does a £1 million pension pot get you at today's rates? Well, if we went to buy just an annuity with that pension pot, at today's rates that would get you an income of around £38,000 per year. So with state pension on top, that's around £50,000 per year. So you're actually earning considerably more in retirement than you were as the teacher in your day job for 40 years. So that's obviously a very generous pension to retire onto. Alternatively, you could look to have a flexible drawdown method. And so there are various ways that we could benchmark this. But if we say that you pulled out 4% of the starting value of your pot and increase that with inflation every year for the rest of your retirement, then you could realistically expect to not run out of money in a 30-year time period. In fact, with a 100% stocks portfolio, there's some research that suggests you would have a 95% chance of not running out of money. So that would give you broadly the same kind of numbers as the annuity. It'd be a couple of £1,000s higher, but still you're looking around that £50,000 per year in income. So both of these, by managing the risk yourself, you're potentially looking at a higher reward in retirement. Now obviously this would suit the person who would wait for the person to come back into the room to get that second marshmallow. If you're the kind of person that wouldn't wait for that second marshmallow, then managing your pension yourself is probably a risk that you're putting on your retirement in the future. Because what's to stop you just cutting down that contribution to get some extra money now? And therein lies the crux of the problem here. Defined benefit pension schemes offer the chance for you to have a fixed return in your retirement, and it takes away that decision from you about needing to delay some gratification because you just don't have a choice. Whereas a defined contribution scheme is much more reliant on you making the active choice to delay some gratification by saving some money into your pension. Now, I like some sweet treats, but I also like to think I'm quite good at delayed gratification. I've eaten far too many of those in different takes. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think it's a good idea, considering that most defined benefit schemes in the public sector are unfunded? In other words, there's no pot of money. People who are paying in now are paying the pensions of people who have retired. So schemes like this move the burden off the taxpayer and onto the individual. But obviously there are the downsides that I've covered here. You take on the additional risk as the individual. So what would you do? Would you stick with your teacher's pension if you were the teacher in this situation? Or would you swap to that defined contribution pension, potentially having the higher payoff in retirement? While you mull that over and discuss in the comments down below, YouTube thinks you'll enjoy this video next. Now it's one picked from the algorithm, so you get to see how much the algorithm knows you. But until next time, I'll see you soon.